So welcome back to this last session of the day, in which we will listen to some different perspectives on the opportunities and problems with national and local budgets as a tool for climate mitigation. We have an intriguing panel consisting of the formerly known Kevin Andersson, which you have met here today. Mikael Åhlman, as some of you met in one of the breakout rooms, he's environmental strategist at the Uppsala region. Emma Wallin, chef of analysis at Klimatsekretariatet, and Lina Isacs, eller Isacs, researcher in ecological economics here at Uppsala University. And I would also like to welcome the moderator, Isak Stoddard. Over to you, Isak.
Thank you, Jonas. I think we can all join up on stage here to get this conversation started. You can start with Emma, can have the mic. So great to see you all back here in this wonderful room that we're in, and also great to see, well, I don't see you on Zoom, but you're very welcome back anyways. As Jonas said, my name is Isak Stoddard, and I'm a PhD candidate here at Uppsala University in the Department of Earth Sciences, and focusing on climate and energy transitions with an empirical focus mainly on Sweden, and basically researching the integration or how carbon budgets are being used as a way to sort of steer climate mitigation in Sweden. So I've been thinking a lot about this concept of the carbon budget, and as this day is to think about both the concept of the carbon budgets, but also its use and its implementation, and also its development. I think one of the best ways to do that is to think about that in a critical way, but also in a sort of constructive way. So I think that's the kind of the purpose of putting together this panel to round off this day. And I'm going to try to speak fairly slowly because this is in English, and English is not the mother tongue of most people in this room, including the people on the panel. So we're Kevin, I know, and I are also very grateful that you're willing to speak English, but if you can't find a word in English, just say the Swedish word, and most of the people in the room will understand.
Also come and maybe do like this, and that means put your mic higher up.
No, the mic should be down here, according to the technicians.
Don't have it on the floor.
No, exactly. No. So in the description for this session, it was written, carbon budgets from the global to the local level have certainly instilled a sense of urgency and the central importance of thinking cumulatively about climate mitigation. But what are some of the risks and limitations of using carbon budgets and other quantitative, science-based approaches to inform societal change? And before we talked a lot about the sort of the global level, the international level, and also down to the national level. But I think one of the things that I want to bring up here is to discuss the sort of the regional level or the local level as well, which I know two of you on the panel have worked a lot with as well. And we're going to also have a bit of a taster tonight in preparation for tomorrow, where there's another panel discussion where one of the central questions there is what happens when we bring an economic logic to the governance of environmental problems. And finally, one of the questions that we're going to try to discuss is how we can then develop the carbon budget concept to take account of the concerns that have been raised in this panel discussion as well and throughout this day. And with me, I have 4 wonderful people, friends and colleagues, which I thought that all of you could say just a few words about yourself to introduce yourself, so people in the room know who you are, and then I'll move into some questions. But I think one of the things with this panel is also that we have both researchers and practitioners on the panel as well, to sort of combine different entry points to this question. So we don't, because at the university sometimes we tend to get stuck in conceptual thinking and not try to relate that in different ways to the different realities that exist outside of the walls of this amphitheater. So that's also an ambition with this conversation, to sort of bring these different worlds together. So on that note, I'll just ask Emma if you would like to say just briefly, who are you? And yeah, I think that.
I'm Emma. I have a background in the theoretical philosophy. And a few years back, I changed career and ended up at Klimatsekretariatet, who works with popularizing the carbon budgets that have been allocated from the global level to regional and municipality level by, Kevin and Isak, for example. So I live in Gränna at a small farm, and my everyday work consists a lot in talking to local officials at different municipalities and trying to figure out how to use and implement a carbon budget thinking at the municipality level.
Yes, hello. Hello, my name is Mikael Åhlman. I'm working as an environmental strategist at the Region Uppsala, which is more working on the Uppsala County level. And I have a master in international management at Uppsala University from the beginning, and I've been working primarily in my working period in the private sector in different areas, and I've been the last 10 years working in the public sector, but on the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, in Uppsala Municipality, in Uppsala Wastewater Treatment Company, Uppsala Vatten and Avfall, and at Region Uppsala. So I had quite a broad experience from different public actors and also from the private sector. So that's I'm living born in Uppsala. I've been working out abroad in Brussels and other places, but now I'm back in Uppsala.
Yes, my name is Lina Isacs, and I work at the same department as Isak and Kevin occasionally, and here in Uppsala. I have a background in economics, and I call myself also an ecological economist, like Thomas Hahn here. I work with, I've mainly worked with conceptual and philosophical underpinnings and ideas of economics, how that impacts our thinking and policy making, that's what I'm doing at the moment. And I finished my PhD last year, so I'm sort of a new researcher new researcher.
Hello, I'm Kevin Anderson. Sorry.
An old researcher.
I'm an old researcher, apparently. No, that's fair. That's a fair comment. I'm Kevin Anderson, and I'm a researcher at Manchester University, but I also work here with Isak at Uppsala and with another colleague, Jesse and Sophie, over there in Bergen. Originally was an engineer, and I was a practicing engineer. I used to design and build oil platforms on and offshore, and also I did my apprenticeship in the engine rooms of ships traveling around the world a long time ago now. And I work on the concept of carbon budgets, and much of my analysis and my time is spent thinking about things in a quantitative fashion, in a numerical fashion. But really my underpinning for that is much more sort of value-driven and to do with views of the world and so forth. But the way that I interpret that is through the numbers. But the numbers are just there as a tool to help to understand the broader value system underneath that.
So thanks everyone for that brief introduction. It's great to get a sense of who you are, not only as researchers or as practitioners, but also as human beings. And I think I'd like to start with you, Emma, in relationship to the work that you've been doing over the last few years then, and the sort of, I guess, with your philosophical background, have sort of headed into this question of climate mitigation within Sweden mainly, I guess, and at the regional level. So could you tell us briefly about that work that you've been doing with Klimatsekretariatet and the ways in which you've seen that carbon budgeting has been shifting, if they has been shifting the conversations and the ways in which Swedish municipalities, regions and counties are thinking and planning in relationship to the urgency to mitigate climate change and the climate transition?
Yes, so I would like to start by going through a mental shift that I think at least have that I have gone through, and I think maybe Anders as well, who I work closely with, and we were once starting up this organization. So in the beginning, when we were developing our tool, our carbon budget tool, we were kind of thinking that it will be hard to get municipalities and regions to accept the carbon budgets, and especially to show it off. Like, why would they want to show off their failure publicly, which it basically means. But we also thought that when they actually got the tool and when they showed it off, it would have a subversive effect, that then we would see action taking place. They would involve other actors within their territory. They would kind of shout out that, look at this, we have to act. And we were wrong about both of these expectations. So first, it was quite easy to get municipalities and regions to accept the carbon budgets. But they didn't mind showing off the failure. It was like, oh, awful, yes, we can't do anything. And it didn't, at least not as much as we want, have the subversive effect of triggering immediate action. So that is kind of what now is pointing out the direction for our work. How do we put pressure on the organizations that actually get the carbon budget in order to get them to act on the problem described by the carbon budget? And we do see some actions in different municipalities. So, for example, tomorrow we will have 3 different municipalities represented that in different ways have reached out to local business, trying to using the carbon budget as a pedagogic tool as well as a communicative tool to kind of share a common compass to show the direction that the climate work has to take. And then we're far off, of course, from a situation where you start allocating the budget to different levels and saying you will do that and I will do that and so on. And we can discuss if that's even possible. But yeah. So in the worst case, they use it as a feather in the cap, like, oh, we're so good, we have this carbon budget, and think of the carbon budget as a mitigating measure in itself, which it's not, of course. In the best case, they use it to reach out to other parts of the geographic area in order to, join. What do you say? Join forces. I don't like the military vocabulary, but.
Hand over to Kevin. So I'd like to follow that up. Thank you, Emma, for sharing those reflections of your work and the interactions you've had with Swedish subnational actors, political actors. I'd like to sort of switch over then to the UK and to think about, because I know you, Kevin, have over many years actually have been engaging with, well, not only in the UK, but you have been engaging with UK policymakers at the national level, but also at the subnational level with city councils and so forth. So what Emma is describing here, is that at all mirrored, or is there some similarities, or are there some differences with how this has been playing out in the UK? I'm thinking also the relationship between the researchers and sort of your research group and also the different actors you've been working with in the UK.
There were certainly some crossovers. Lots of, I wish I could give you the number now, but I can't, but many councils, many tens of councils now in the UK have carbon budgets, because we have a tool that they're able to use now for free, so they can estimate their carbon budget and they get a little report. And I think some of those use it, as you say, it's just, oh, well, that's it. Oh, we've solved the problem, we've got a carbon budget. But obviously that misunderstands it. But there are other councils, and generally it's the ones that have more money. So it's the more metropolitan level councils. Probably not true for all of them, but by and large. And that those councils are also then trying to implement something from the carbon budgets, and some more stringently than others. I think it would be fair to say that probably the most those active in this has been Manchester, and that's a big council. It's 3 million people within 9 councils that come together within the regional area. But it also has a very influential mayor who has bought into the agenda, so it shows the importance there of someone who at least has bought into that and that had other people around them that's influenced them. We work a lot with them because we're based in Manchester. That's been helpful. But because I think it has the resources, it's been able to put in some people to help think, well, what does this look like? What would the pathway look like? So they've not only got a carbon budget, but they've got some pathways. And as soon as you get the pathways, you realise how much they're failing by. So that has been a challenge for them. But what I think, and I was thinking about this when you were talking about it before, one of the powers of the carbon budget has been in Manchester has been how it's been used by civil society groups to put pressure on the mayor and the Green Plan. So there are very strong objections to the Green Plan, or people saying this is nowhere near enough to deliver on the pathways. So it has been really helpful, I think, for other people who want to then take the policymakers to task about not delivering on what they've promised to deliver on. So I think that has been a really useful tool. That hasn't happened in all councils, but it's certainly been important in some councils. And I think across most of where there are mayors with some power in the UK, they typically now have a policy agenda, or at least have a target framework that is much more demanding than the national government. So I think that's been interesting. The carbon budget does seem to have helped, along with civil society, in pushing regional policymakers much harder than they would have to do if they were just to deliver on the national commitment. So that's a positive message to come out of that, not positive enough.
Thanks, Kevin. I'd like to go over to Mikael. And I know, Mikael, you've worked for many, many years in Sweden at both the national level and different capacities, but also at the regional level with trying to develop frameworks or decision support systems to be able to mitigate climate change at the regional level. So I thought I'd just like to hear your thoughts on what has been said so far, and specifically perhaps, because I know we've talked over lunches many, many times about this, from this work that you've been doing, this kind of on-the-ground work, what do you see as some of the problems or perhaps limitations of a carbon budget approach when working at the regional level?
Yeah, well, I'll try to put it shortly. Have we got 45 minutes? Or well, I think one thing is if you think about the basic concept of carbon budgets, it's really that we have a kind of a planetary boundaries thinking, that we said we have these boundaries that we have to be able to have our societal development within, and then we try to break it down into the different geographies. We're working at countries and regions and municipalities, and I think that is one challenge to start with, because normally these geographical areas, they are more often very more administratively assigned to where are the borders going. But if you look at the environment as such, I mean, you have to look at how is the biospheres, how are the forests organized, and what is having an impact on what we are doing in our society. So I think sometimes we get trapped in these administrative geographies, which couldn't be more or less relevant. And then also we have what we call the technospheres, where we have not so much nature left, which we normally call cities. There maybe you can have a specific strategy, because everything is more like this technosphere. In other areas, maybe we have to look in how do we organize our work in these kinds of biospheric regions, because there you have a lake and there you have some forests, and there you have to think much broader, and how do we interact between the technosphere and the biosphere. So it's not only all the time it's natural to put the carbon budget on a municipality. It's maybe more a carbon budget on how this biosphere going to survive and develop and giving ecosystem services in the future. And as I talked in our lecture or our seminar, there are so many, but if you just talk about the public sector, so many actors working in the same geography. We have the municipality, which is consisting of what we call förvaltning, I don't know the English word, but and we also have municipality companies, and then we have the region, and we have the länsstyrelse, the county level. We have the national departments, like in Sweden we have Svenska kraftnät and Trafikverket, and we have the Swedish Armed Forces, and all of them have activities going on down in the same geography. So I think we have to think about, if we have a crisis and we put, you are going to do that, you are going to do that, and we do kind of a bottom up, and everybody's double counting or forgetting something, and we end it up and it's a mess. And some will say, oh, by the way, we didn't manage. But tough luck, we just go ahead. I think then we have to really look at how do we firstly get the public actors together and realize first we have a crisis and we have to coordinate our plans together regarding spatial planning and physical planning and stuff like that in the geographical areas that makes sense. Because the challenge with carbon dioxide emissions is that they are invisible. The impact is maybe bigger somewhere else than what you see in front of you. In other emissions, you see the impact directly. The water is not tasting well, or you smell it in the air, but with carbon dioxide you don't see it. So I think you have to have much more think about which geographical areas we should work with and what is the logic behind that, and collect all the public actors, because there are four different political actor levels: the European level, the national level, the county level, and the municipality level. And everybody said you have to talk to the politics. Which politics in which context? Because they have so many different responsibility areas. And I think we are not really treating this as a crisis. We're doing it in a business environment, business as usual mode. We are using the structures as business as usual. But as I said in our session, crisis is the opportunity for change. As the Greek word for crisis is, no one Greek in the audience, I hope, said that there is opportunity for change. So then treat it as a crisis and coordinate it much further. Maybe I talked too long.
Great. Thank you, Mikael. I'm actually taking a PhD course in the history of crisis, which I just started, so I can't say much about it yet, but we can discuss that later. Lina, since we're using this concept of a budget, I mean, that comes from somewhere, right? And we had a discussion in one of the breakout sessions earlier about the sort of, the economic perspectives on using budgets to reach various targets or strategies. But yeah, you said you were an ecological economist, and I guess there's a sort of transition, I guess, if I understood it correctly, from sort of more of an environmental economics lens to a sort of an ecological economics lens. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on this, because I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about, the risks and the problems with sort of valuation of various things. So what are the limitations about that, valuing nature, putting a price on ecosystem, so-called services, etc. So what are your thoughts so far on what has been said from your economist perspective? Research perspective.
Yeah, I think I can maybe align to or link to some of what you just said now, Martin. That so what I've been thinking a lot about. Yeah, sorry.
No problem.
So part of the description for this panel was what happens when we use an economic logic or economic language in areas where in environmental areas, for example, and that is very much economic logic is very much about simplification, as I see it, and ways of looking at trying to make decision making easier to handle although it's very complex. So I've been looking at the valuation side, as you said. So what is it that we try to achieve? What is the purpose of economic activity, and how can we measure that? And that's what economists usually do. So conventionally, what you call mainstream or neoclassical economists tend to reduce everything into money and do that with quite firm a quite strong theory behind why this makes sense and why this is good to do. So, so on the valuation side, when you look at that, what it is that we want to achieve, and we want to reduce it to one run the same unit. I think the problem that we have with that is that we equalize, or we get further away from what it is that we actually want. The actual, so to say, and I suppose it's the same if you look at the cost side here. What it is that we need to do if we break down activities where we work with how to reach a carbon budget strategy, for example. I guess we need to. It needs to make sense to people to know what it is we actually work with. And I might perhaps develop it more, but so this idea of incommensurability that I also think Kevin has talked about when you talk about the substitution. When you work with a unit as CO2, you have to be able to, or what you risk doing is having to translate everything into one and the same quantity and make that understandable. The risk is that you try to, you make it too abstract to people. And so in terms of risks with working with carbon budgets in that sense, I guess that might link to that, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing to this picture, that there is a big risk for a pitfall when you're working with. We were talking about the bio-based circular economy, and try to use resources much longer in the loops, and because then we are decreasing the emissions and so forth, and we have to also closing the loops for materials and molecules and stuff like that. But there could be a risk for that. That means that you maybe do a lot more locally in your own geography. You're working more with the agriculture sector. You're exploiting much more, which is good. But in your carbon budget, it could suddenly show up a lot of carbon emissions in your geographical context, which was earlier hidden because it was built into technology or other things in other processes elsewhere. And suddenly by getting this more local circular economy, you start to get new emissions that you didn't have before, if you know what I mean. So you have to be very pedagogical, say, yeah, we have a lot of more emissions now in the agriculture sector, but that is offset by this and this and this. So just not focusing on the actual number, focus on what is behind the numbers, because it's very difficult to see. I used to work in the Swedish EPA with the Swedish consumption's climate emissions and the impact of that. And you can see that all the palm oil was coming from Amsterdam, for instance. So it's very difficult to see where are the resources exploited and so forth. So I think that's something we have to bear in mind. Sorry. Thanks.
So I would just like to say something about what I think is positive about the budget perspective. Okay, for me, it kind of turns things around in this sense that if we have this limited resources, and in this sense, I think it's not even a metaphor. It's like the economy in its most basic sense. At least if you look at the global carbon budget, it's not a metaphor. It's economy in its most basic sense. But so if you think about it in that way, then when we have this limited resource, we can start off discussions like, what do we want to use it for? What is important to us? And can we do these things in a way that does not require fossil fuels? How do we, in that case, transform our actions and so on towards such a situation? Are there areas of that where it's more difficult to phase out fossil fuels? In that case, do we need to save more of this limited resource for those areas and so on? And there I think the budget perspective is very what do you say, användbart, usable. And but I agree totally that you have to connect it to more concepts that are closer to our everyday life. So, for example, and I think that's doable. So, for example, if let's say that we have a mitigation rate of 15% a year, what does that mean? Well, if you look at parts of the budget, for example, cars, and you think that, well, it means that if you're going to keep that rate for 100 car travels, 15 has to go, right? I mean, of course, that's an idealization because they can be differently long and everything. But if you start to think about it in that way, at least to me, it doesn't seem impossible that you can manage to do that. 15 in 100. Next year it will be something like, if for 15% again, 12 of the rest of the 100 and so on. And if you start like taking, if you think about, well, some of these have to be switch the fuel to electricity or something. Someone has to start bicycling instead of taking their car. Someone else has to go on the train. Then you could collect 15. And if you do that on a societal level, like bringing in local business, civil society, tell them that this is what has to happen. I think that's a good way of using the economical language and or the implications of it to communicate what has to happen.
So to sort of great, thanks for leading us into the next final concluding part of the panel, where I'd like to ask the rest of you also, sort of building on Emma's sort of comment here as well, or contribution. And you can also respond to this after we've heard from them. So how can we then develop the carbon budget concept further based on these sort of, you know, these critiques, but also these, and the way it's used, but also it's also the opportunities and the things that it actually does show. What are your thoughts on that? A few words from each of you.
I should start. I think if we put the carbon budget boundary on the national level and we start there, and if we want to break it down closer to reality, so forth, I think that we have to take a more cooperative approach between the national level, including the national authorities, and the regional level and the municipalities, and work with it together in the different regions, and not dividing it up on different actors and they are doing their own bean counting, so to speak, and then it doesn't make sense. So I think we have, in Swedish it's called, you should do a samhällsekonomisk konsekvensanalys. You have to do a samhällsekologisk konsekvensanalys, också societal ecological consequence analysis, and do it at these three levels at the same time, because now we're doing it in silos and everybody's saying, yeah, we're doing good thing, and then we start to do the thing, we start, oh, by the way, did you do that and I do that, and nothing happened. It's a kind of a deadlock. So we have to, if we really take this seriously, I think we have to have these three layers coordinated together. So in the Uppsala län case, it should be the national level, the regional, and the länsstyrelse, and the municipalities within that geographical area. I think that should do this jointly. Then I think we have a chance to do it coordinated and work together. And in Uppsala municipality, for instance, the Swedish Armed Forces is a very big actor, and blocks, for instance, or don't allow windmills, for instance, in Uppsala municipality, because so there is a lot of goal conflicts in this. Did I say windmills? I mean the wind power stations. You know what I meant. It's not like in the Dutch countryside. Sorry about this English.
Well, yeah. So I mean, I haven't worked with carbon budgets, as you know. But I think it helps then that I was in your seminar here earlier a bit, because I was just thinking that it seems to be one challenge seems to be how to work with implementation and evaluation and breaking things down or not when you're to sort of work with carbon budgets and how to actually make things happen. And then I thought, and it comes then to this, what I said earlier, that I think it gets important to make it, to get to the bottom also of what it is that we actually have to do, and talk not only in terms of emissions and stare at them, like in the end of the chain of what it is we do, which we have done a lot, I think, in climate policy, too much, rather than looking at the activities, starting at the structural level. Do we have to look at what shouldn't be here anymore, instead of how can we make it more carbon efficient or reduce the carbon intensity of activities. And I think you mentioned that, or also Fredrik, who was in the panel, that looking at what are the activities that we need to question on a purpose level? What's the purpose of having this kind of activity in society? If you see what I mean, like, yeah. So talking about the actual, both in terms of activities and impacts and goals and consequences. So, and then I think it was also Fredrik in that seminar mentioned that the way to evaluate and talk about what happens when we start really looking at how much carbon does this activity have, and how does it, how can we reduce it? If we cannot measure all emissions very detailed for each activity, it can also be important to think of the need to just to talk about and what do you say, redovisa? When you account for things and sort of remember that it is the discussion, it is the qualitative ways of talking about how to reduce and what are the impacts of different activities might be just as useful and important. So text-wise rather than numbers, I think is what he said. And he at least hinted on or said he believed that this can be just as effective as numbers. And yeah.
Well, that leads quite well on to what I was going to say, because there are two ways I see it. First, going up from carbon budgets and then going down from it. So going up from carbon budgets, what are they? They're a way of translating temperature rises that we want to avoid into what that means for us locally. But why are we avoiding temperatures? Because it's to do with impacts. And why we avoid impacts? Because it hurts people. It destroys ecosystems. It hurts our own children. It will eventually hurt us and other people as well. So all the budget is, the carbon budget, is a way of translating things that we say are unacceptable levels of pain and suffering into something that says, well, what do we do to try and alleviate that? So it takes it from that, and we must never forget that. Why are we doing this? It's not about a budget. Who gives a damn about a budget, a number? We're interested in this because it leads to pain and suffering if we don't do something about the way we are living our lives. And the budget is one of the ways, I think it's a very useful way, to translate our concern for pain and suffering of others and indeed of ourselves into what we need to do. But then, although Isak, Jesse, Sophie and myself, we spend a lot of our time, and Thomas, is it 15%? Is it 14%? And perhaps it was only 12%. Perhaps we could split it like this. They're really important discussions for us to have, and I think we need to have those. But really, they're irrelevant in some respects, because ultimately, what the budgets tell us is, do we require, can we deal with this pain and suffering by incremental tweaks, changes to business as usual, a couple of EVs, a couple of wind turbines, a few better quality houses? Is that what we're talking about? Are we talking about something now that is so profound? The budgets, I would argue, the budgets shine a light on how fundamentally we have to change so many facets of our society. And that brings us down to things like equity and fairness, which I spoke about in the session we had earlier, about they're the things that those of us who are the high emitters, like me, we don't want to talk about. But I think the carbon budget now, I don't care about the exact numbers. If it's 5%, okay, we tweak it with a wind turbine. If it's 10, 15, 20%, then that's fundamental shifts to most of the ways we structure our society. Socially, in terms of values, in terms of who has access to things. It's not about EVs now, it's about public transport or travelling less. It's about having no houses that are built over 100 metres squared, and that anyone who comes to sell their house that's bigger than that, it gets split up so that 2 families can live there. It's fundamental changes to facets of our society that we've completely normalised. Wealthier ones of us have normalised. And the budgets tell us that. And that's why a lot of people don't like them. That's why we try and find ways around them. Because they shine a light on the excesses of the few. And those few are the ones that are shaping the debate. And so that's one of the reasons I like the budgets. It helps the civil society to shine that light back on us and say, hey, what about you? What's going on here? And of course, that is the policymakers, it is the academics, it is the entrepreneurs, the CEOs, the billionaires, but it's not just the billionaires, it's the professors and the other senior managers and so forth. So I think it does that. It's those two ends, suffering and pain at one end, and then, well, what does that mean for the structures of our society? And it's fundamental change now, because we should have done it earlier, and we didn't.
Thanks for those strong words, Kevin, to round off this conversation. We're out of time, unfortunately, but I'd like to thank all of you for your wise and insightful comments and reflections on this concept that is a constant development as well. It's a process, where conversations are really important as well. So I'll hand over to Jonas now and to wrap up the day, and we'll continue this conversation also tomorrow in various ways. So thank you.